All right, this is a PowerPoint on meats. First of all, we have beef. Beef is mature cows. They usually say mature cows are beef cattle that is 1 year or more. If it's a baby cow, it would be veal calves 14 weeks or younger. You maybe have had like veal parmesan. You might have heard of that or seen that on a restaurant menu. That's your most tender meats. Lamb would be from young sheep, and pork is from hogs. Some terms that have to do with meats. The cut is the edible portion of the meat. So when you get a beef roast, you know that all that edible part would be called the cut. Marbling is the small white flecks of visible fat that you see throughout a piece of meat. It does help with some tenderness. Collagen, white, thin tissue between the layers of the muscle. It softens as it cooks. Again, if you were maybe having a beef roast, you might notice the collagen, and it might kind of settle around bones if it's a bone-in piece of meat. And it kind of looks like rubber cement glue. Elastin is the thick yellow-white connective tissue, does not soften as it cooks. So sometimes when you're chewing meat, you go, oh, this is so hard to chew, and you can feel sometimes it's kind of like rubber bandish. That would be elastin. The grain is the lengthwise direction of the muscle cells, so you always want to cut with the grain. And then cured meats means they've done something. Sometimes it's salt. There are other ways to cure meats to increase the shelf life and flavor. One that you think of right away would be ham. Here we go. Ham, sausage, cold cuts. Also your smoked and dried meats. Nutritional information of meat. It would be a complete protein, B vitamins, which would be thiamine, niacin, and riboflavin, phosphorus as a mineral, and there's some other trace minerals, and of course it would be tended to be high in fat and cholesterol and your saturated fats. Grading. It's required by federal law for all meat carcasses to be graded. The top three are prime, choice, select. You've probably heard prime rib or you've tasted prime rib. That contains the most marbling. Remember, marbling was the amount of fat that's distributed throughout the meat. Choice is what most of us would find at the grocery store. It's high quality and there's enough marbling to make it tender. And select, less fat and flavor. There are grades that are below this. Prime, choice, select, standard, utility, cutter, canner, and it obviously goes down in quality. You see this prime, choice, select on a sticker that's on the meat. It's usually separate from the label. Sometimes they will stick it on the same label, but a lot of times it is a different label and it looks like a shield on the piece of meat. Pork is not graded, where this is prime, choice, select. Pork won't have a prime, choice, select sticker or grade. Cuts of meat. The carcass of a cow is divided into large cuts, 8 or 9 large cuts. The smaller cuts that we buy at the grocery store are called the retail cut. The bone shape identifies the cut. So if it's got a T-bone, it's going to be a porterhouse steak, which is a really nice, juicy steak, a little bit more expensive. Lean cuts have less than 10 grams of fat in a 3.5-ounce serving. About 3 ounces is your fist, and they say that's about a serving per person. Your ground beef is made from all the trimmings that are attached to the bone, and they grind that up. All the parts that would be the tough parts of the carcass. And then you might see or come across this word variety meats. Now they're not talking about, oh, like a variety of meats, like, oh, there's turkey and there's beef. They're talking about the extra liver, the kidneys, oops, I'm sorry, I spelled that wrong, chitterlings, brain, heart, tongue, tripe with the stomach. Those are called variety meats. So I broke it down a little bit more about the types of meat. So I mentioned that beef was cattle over 1 year old. It's distinctive flavor. It's got a firm texture. It's bright, deep red in color. Ribs, loin, and sirloin would be the tender cuts. The roasts are less tender, and they cook slowly with a moist heat cooking method. We'll talk about those shortly too. And then we have ground beef, and of course exposure to air will turn the meat a different color than the bright red that you might see when you first buy it. So here's all the cuts of meat, and you can see how each of these parts is cut into, and I won't obviously read all these to you. These are going to be more tender. You see where porterhouse is up here on the top. Down here, it's very tough because this is where the cow will have less use of its muscles. So you're going to make this into stew meat. You're going to grind this up into hamburger. The flank is very tough. This whole bottom part here would be tough meat. And you can see even the back here, grounding it up, not as good to use. A lot of us will have short ribs pot roast. My favorite is a chuck roast that comes from this area. Some of you like sirloin steaks. Again, that's on the side. Top sirloin T-bones up here where it's going to be more tender. So I mentioned that the little cow was called a veal. A veal is a little cow about 3 to 14 weeks old. Has very little fat, extremely lean, not too tender, but it is much more tender than a mature cattle. And here you can see the major cuts in a veal. Then you have lamb, young sheep up to 1 year, delicate flavor, tender and nutritious. Quality lamb is grayish pink color with fat. And then if it's an older sheep, it's called a mutton. And here's the parts of the lamb. Pork. Usually you want to have pork that is from a younger pig. Tender meat. Quality pork is grayish pink or darker and firm with a small amount of marbling. There's that marbling word again, meaning the distribution of fat. And there's your carcass of a pig. Then we mentioned about organ meats, liver, kidney, heart, tongue. They're nutritious, they're tough, so you want to cook them with moist heat cooking methods. And then some different types of meat. You could have a processed meat handled for reasons other than cutting. So your cured meats, treated with curing agents, salting it, putting it in a brine, tend to have a saltier flavor. That's why when sometimes we have ham, we get really thirsty because there's so much salt as a preservative, as a process. And then the methods of cooking meat. It's said about moist heat and dry heat cooking methods. Moist heat kind of makes sense, something where you're going to add liquid. Dry heat, you have broiling. In our gas ovens, you can actually see the flames in our broilers, usually on the bottom. In an electric oven, or the ones we have in our classroom, the coils are at the top inside your oven, and that's your broiler. Usually when you're broiling, it's the hottest temperature of your oven. So in an electric oven, you always want to keep the door ajar, a little bit open. Now that's different if you have a gas. Roasting, you cook that with dry heat. Some people will set it on a rack inside their pan, a roasting pan itself, and bake it in the oven. Then you can pan broil on top of your stove. Sometimes people put a little fat in there to pan broil a piece of meat. Frying, I think everybody knows what that is, pan fried in a small amount of fat. Braising is when you brown the meat and you add a little water, and sometimes people will brown things first before they put it into the oven. Cooking in liquid, which would be much more than braising. Cooking in liquid is stewing meats. If you think if you've ever had beef stew, that's with the gravy, and then the beef stew meat is very chewy. That's why you stew it, to soften it up. And if you're going to cook a frozen meat without thawing it, it's going to take 50% longer to cook. So that when it's thawed, you've taken a roast out of the oven and you go, okay, this will take me 2-3 hours. If it was frozen, you're going to probably have to add another hour to 2 hours to get that meat done. What does cooking do? Flavor. It helps develop the flavor. The texture, low fat, moisture shrinks, muscles get firmer. If you overcook it, makes sense. If it's a dry heat method, it's going to dry out and get tough, stringy, chewy. If it's a moist heat method, it gets more mushy and it loses its flavor. And then you're going to obviously see color changes. Beef, red to dark brown, pork and poultry to beige. You want to complete the cooking method to prevent bacteria growth. So you want to check the internal temperature to make sure it's 160 degrees if you have a meat thermometer. Check the color by cutting into the meat. There is something in pork that if you don't cook it to 160, you can get this parasite called trichinosis, so that's important. And here's your degrees of doneness. Most of the restaurants will have a little disclaimer that we cook all our meats to medium. You can ask, that's why they ask you, well done, medium well, would be 165, or you can go the other way, medium rare at 150 and rare at 140. The buying and storing. Most expensive part of your food budget is meat. You want to compare the cost per serving of the different cuts and types of meats. Obviously, a pound of ground beef serves about 4 people. That's different than if I was going to get steak and try to serve a group of 4. Well, 1 pound is not going to serve a group of 4. So you have to compare. Substitute legumes, which are dried peas and beans. Store in the coldest part of your refrigerator, and you should use it within 2 days. Now, if you freeze it, obviously you can use it longer, but if you just bring it home from the grocery store, you want to use it within 2 days. That's for beef, like a beef roast, steak. Hamburger, they say 24 hours. Ground products before you freeze them don't have the same storage life. And then you want to defrost them properly in your refrigerator. And then it says, if you finish reading this, because this was one of the days we had our e-learning day when the juniors were taking the ACT last year. So don't worry about this last slide. So that is the information, just a quick brief overview of meats. We could talk hours, I could spend weeks on meats. We could just take beef and spend one whole week on it. There's a lot to learn. And a lot to know about beef and meats in general. Thank you.